This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 175. What can we do about pay gaps?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast. This week, well, rich and poor, male and female, north and south, young and old, pay gaps seem insurmountable. We can try and solve the gender pay gap by, for example, insisting there's a set ratio of women in key roles and that the pay is the same irrespective of gender for the same job. But does it work? And in any case, those approaches don't work when you're trying to solve the rich-poor gap. For that, you've got to pay the poor more and the rich less. But then people start arguing that you are disincentivizing the desire to make money. Apparently the rich don't want to be rich if there aren't enough poor people to make them feel good about their lot in life. Today, we look at the pay gaps and how to fix them. That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Now, did you know in the UK there's a government website where you can plug in the name of a company and you can find out what the gender pay gap is? So for the BBC, for example, for every hour women worked, they earn 93 pence for that hour for every £1 that men earn. For BP, it's 80 pence for every pound a man makes. Genderpaygap.service.co.uk if you want to have a go and a bit of fun with that one. In the UK as a whole, men earn an average £555 a week last year, but for women, it was just £370. Now, that is not the case everywhere because my wife is definitely the breadwinner, but maybe that highlights another aspect of pay gaps. What about the age gap? Because I'm older and youth unemployment is a travesty. It's over 10% for the UK and less than 3% for those aged 25 to 49. But for women over 50, the unemployment rate falls to 2.2%. Not so for men. It's close to 3%. So in fact, older men are worse off than older women, it seems. And in those older age groups, the unemployed are far, far more likely to be out of work for 2 years or more. Basically, written off by employees, in other words. And obviously, it also depends on where you live. If you're in London, you'll earn £727 a week. In Huddersfield, where you need to keep the heating on all day for a big chunk of the year, you'll earn just £424. That's less than 60% of the London salary. So, Steve, we are seeing a huge variation in wealth. What kind of damage can be done to an economy when you've got this big variation in income by all of those aspects I've talked about? And is it realistic to expect that we're actually going to be able to correct some of these differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have made some headway compared to much earlier days. I mean, I remember vividly because I actually was dating a nurse at the time this happened. Back in Australia, the pay gap between doctors and nurses was astronomical. And the reason was the nurses were still being paid as if they were apprentices. And so they were getting wages which were about, even compared to sales assistants, they were getting a lower pay than sales assistants. And because they're working in industry where if you don't turn up for work, there's a possibility somebody's going to die because the nurse didn't change the tubes or whatever else. They never had the industrial muscle to go on strike, and they just got worse and worse and worse. And then just when I was dating this particular nurse, I don't take any claim for this actually happening, but they decided, bugger it, we're going on strike, and they actually literally, I think, pretty close to tripled their wage. So, but it's still, of course, once that was done, they came much closer to that. They certainly got better than sales assistants, and they got closer to a reasonable gap between themselves and doctors and so on.
But that's isn't it where we've seen it corrected, isn't it? Isn't it happening in the public sector by and large, but not happening in the private sector? So it's easier, isn't it? The government can just say, "Oh, we need to do something about this, so we're going to push wages up." And let me give you another example similar to that. Is if you look at we're getting more people educated. That's seeing more women and ethnic minorities being educated, but more than half of women work in the public sector, compared to just 10% of white males working in the public sector. So it seems like the public sector is doing all the hard yards here. We may be getting more educated women, but those educated women are working in the education sector, educating other women to become educated, but not really affecting the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the what clouds our minds, I think, is the neoclassical concept that you get paid what you're worth. This idea of what they call pay being reflecting your marginal productivity. And with that attitude, the point then comes down and says, well, is there a marginal productivity gap between men and women? Taking one of those gaps you're talking about in a specific area, for example, medicine? And the answer is hands down no. There's absolutely no reason why gender should have any impact on somebody's skill as a doctor, or for that matter, skill as a nurse. But we still see these gaps persisting. And the reason is because the theory itself is bollocks. If you want to find any real basis on which you get a differentiation in income, apart from the worker and capitalist bit, which is something we should talk about as well in this conversation, it comes down to hierarchy. It's a position in your hierarchy, and the best work I've seen done on that is by the Canadian economist Blair Fix, where he simply reinterprets he tried to make sense of all the income distribution data, both inside companies, between nations, inside nations, and using every metric he looked at. The only one that made any sense was the scale of the hierarchy somebody's in. How many layers are there between the bottom and the top level, and where do you sit in that layer? That overwhelmingly determined not just the income gaps between one class and another, but the income earned by the top executives versus those by the bottom employees. So in that sense, it says, well, being in the right part of a hierarchy matters, and bang, we come back to the sexism in human society, right, that the men tend to dominate the hierarchy.
Yeah, but I mean, no surprise that people at the top of that hierarchy are earning more than people at the bottom. But whether why can't a woman be at the top? Other than the fact that historically they haven't. If we were starting from scratch now and building that hierarchy today, there's no reason why a woman wouldn't be at the top rather than the man.
Well, I know some organisations where that happened, and I might just say on that basis, I express some of my cynicism here. What it meant, we got female sociopaths at the top of organisations rather than male sociopaths. So it didn't actually improve things for people down below them in the hierarchy. But nonetheless, it can happen. But I think then we just come down to this is simply the biological fact. Women are the ones who reproduce, men don't. We have never worked out a way to say that the men are going to carry the child raising burden to the same extent that women do. I know your family is rather different on that front. You are that.
That's because I'm not that bright. My wife.
Well,
works.
you do a bit more. You are the guys at home most of the time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean we have turned things around in this family. That's true. But but why are women working? Why still? Even though we've had this rise in education, why are women predominantly, and it is more than half of all women, are working in the public sector rather than the private sector? Why is that happening?
Well, it's quite possibly just because, again, the public sector is going to be more flexible in terms of things like maternity leave, taking leave, making allowances for that. There's a reason the public sector has at least to give more than just a verbal nod to principles of equality and so on. If you don't meet up to them, then you find yourself being criticised before Parliament. That's rather more effective than what you can impose in terms of pressures on a private organisation. So they're more likely, if society, as has happened over the last 30 or 40 years, says we have to be ensuring equality of opportunity, then it's going to be more firmly practiced in the public sector than it is in the private sector.
And the answer to that equality of opportunity very often is to say, well, we need to make sure that more people are educated. And we've done a lot on that since the 1980s, haven't we?
No, we've gone bloody backwards, pardon me.
Except more people are going off and getting a university degree, whether it's devalued those university degrees. The jury is out on that.
I'm firmly in the camp that it's devalued those degrees, because what we've really been doing is using universities as a form of child minding to hide the level of youth unemployment. Because if you go back to the breakdown date for me in terms of the capacity of capitalism to generate full employment is 1973. And it's striking how dramatic the change was in that particular year. To take, of course, the one I know best, being Australia, being my home country, unemployment went from about 1.5% to 5% at that period. And from that time on, gradually, the notion of what used to be full employment was anything below 2%. Well, even 2% was seen as a bit high. And from that point on, 5% was seen as full employment. So there's a real structural shift in capitalism from that point forward. And that's also coincided, of course, with the pressures to try to achieve gender and other forms of pay equality.
Yeah. And there's education and education, isn't there? Because for all the education that's available, we're still being governed by senior ministers who went to Eton. So we still have this position of privilege, don't we, in the UK? But what about
come back to hierarchy?
Back to hierarchy again, absolutely. But that's just inherent, isn't it? I mean, over time, you can presumably knock down that hierarchy. It's just that it takes time, because what you're talking about is a cultural thing, isn't it?
No. This is actually an important point. Again, I highly recommend people to read Blair Fix's work on this stuff. Blair's publishing a blog. I can't, off the top of my head, pull up the name of the blog, but I'll do that when you're chatting again. I'll type into the computer and get his website. But he's found that in that sense, hierarchy is the most persistent and perennial feature of human society, because we wouldn't have human societies on the scale that we have without hierarchy. And the title of Blair's blog post by this is all one word: economics from the top down .wordpress.com. And it's brilliant research. And what he's found is that hierarchy is an organizing principle which goes right back to the beginning of agrarian societies, and even to some extent in pre-agrarian societies in human history. We wouldn't actually have anything other than small gatherings of about 150 people maximum, unless we had hierarchy. And this applies whether you're talking about a slave society, which is the ancient Romans and Sumerian societies, or you're talking Middle Ages with peasants and feudal lords, or you're talking capitalism now, or for that matter, you were talking socialism under the Soviets. So the hierarchy is that essential. You cannot get rid of hierarchy.
Really? Can we with technology, though, I wonder? I mean, has that situation changed? Because hierarchy is there just because you've got large numbers of people and you've got to sort them out in some way, haven't you? So you've got to have people managing, and then you've got to have people managing the managers. But I just wonder with technology whether that changes, whether we're going to have a more egalitarian society. I just think of my own experience, where I've worked in corporate life for a long time, and now I'm freelancing, and I work with a variety of companies with people at different levels. There's no sense of hierarchy in my business because there's only me, and I'm working within other organizations where, I'm working across that hierarchy. I don't know if everyone was just interplaying online somehow, just getting jobs done, whether the very nature of the internet would sort out that ability for large quantities of work to be done without that sense of hierarchy that you're talking about.
Oh, my dear mate, I'd hate to tell you you're dreaming a neoclassical dream there.
Occasionally I make these mistakes.
You do. That's in some ways, if you look at neoclassical theory, they can't understand why corporations exist in the first place. The whole idea that a firm exists is a puzzle for them. The whole theory, Ronald Coase's attempts to explain why do we have a system in a market economy which is hierarchical, when, of course, it should all be a basis of competition. And the neoclassical vision of the world is a whole bunch of perfectly competitive firms, the perfect, of course, being one of those totally imperfect words, a piece of pejorative language used as a statement of fact in economics. But they would imagine that you should have rather than having a huge corporation, like General Motors used to be, where there's a set of bosses, a set of people working in marketing, a set of people working elsewhere, all following orders. They should all be supplying those services as a competitive firm to each other, and it also be mediated by price. And what we find instead, it's mediated by hierarchy. And partially this is just the sheer scale of human operations. So if you want to, for example, maintain the borders of the Roman Empire, it's rather easier to have a coherent policy if there's a hierarchy than if you have a bunch of perfectly competitive centurions trying to maintain a little bunch of 100 soldiers. So
I'll go and get killed for less money than the.
That's right. I'll be a cheaper slaughter on the German front. Yeah.
Or maybe if you're smart, you'll go, no, I'm going to charge more to be killed than. And therefore I don't get chosen. That would be the logical way, wouldn't it? But I mean,
that's a Russell Crowe approach. Yeah.
with this hierarchy, though, I mean, if we're stuck with it, then the issue becomes, what's the difference in price between the person at the top and the person at the bottom?
Yeah, and that's the issue that I think we need to look at. It's if you look at all these various things, the gender gap, and we've done a lot about that in terms of removing the enormous barriers that used to exist. I'll give my favourite example at that front. My mother and father both met when they were working in the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And when they got married, the law or the rule within the Commonwealth Bank is the woman had to resign.
Yeah, I remember you saying that before.
And that was just what my mother did. Now, 1952, there she was, got married, bang, left and became a housewife.
Australia has moved on a bit since then, hasn't it? Just a little bit.
I'm thinking.
I thought I'd lost you for a second. I did say just a little bit.
No, okay. I think actually one of my good mates back in Australia makes a very reasonable point that what should have happened, if you look back at the 1950s household, and again, that's just being the generational issue, I can make that span. Though you had one person working and the other compelled to stay at home, the standard of living in terms of the quality of life you could have was different, of course, in terms of the technology and energy consumption we've gone from in those days. But it wasn't an impossible life by any means to be a sole income earner, paying for a mortgage, getting the money to pay for the family and so on. It was feasible. Now you need two to do it.
Because that's made the problem worse as well, hasn't it? Because you can have two people on low wages. The differential between those two people on low wages is far greater than two people on high wages in the one household.
And what you've got is for people at the bottom of the hierarchy, again, the salaries haven't risen. Again, 73 to 75 is another important point in sort of turning points in capitalism, because up until that period, wages were rising at the same rate as labour productivity. Now, labour productivity is one of those words I hate because it's not a real measure. Labour productivity is the ratio of the GDP to the population. And that is actually the definition of labour productivity, and it therefore makes people think that the way to make the economy grow fast is to make people more productive. It's got bugger all to do with people's productivity. When I do the analysis in terms of energy, that ratio, labour productivity ratio, actually tells you the ratio of the energy throughput of machinery to the energy throughput of unskilled workers, and that's been rising, of course, over time. But in fact, that has got nothing to do with the income that comes back to the worker. It's totally devoid from whatever their own productivity is. So we have weakened the bargaining power of workers by increasing how many workers there are. At the same time, we've had the debt bubble, which has been, this is where my own research provides a contribution. When I look at the world in a social class terms, in terms of workers, capitalists, and bankers, which is the way I analyse the social breakdown or social division, then as the level of private debt rises, and this is a dynamic out of a complex system, when I define the economy at the aggregate level, just in terms of the wages share of GDP, which gives you income distribution, the employment rate, which gives you the effective level of economic activity, how many workers are needed given the how much population is actually needed for a job in the production system, and then the private debt to GDP ratio. And I have in that model where the debt is just used to finance investment by corporations, so no borrowing by workers, and it's all about building productive capacity, so there's no Ponzi elements to it all. As the debt level rises, the share of workers falls. It is an income distribution dynamic in a capitalist economy with finance. It's the workers who pay for a high level of private debt. And so you put that on top as well, and the hierarchy effect that Blair talks about, this effect of a complex system dynamic out of capitalism, that it's what determines the level of economic activity. And the person who first got this right was actually Karl Marx, even though he got most things wrong. The thing that determines the level of economic activity is the level of investment by capitalists. That level of investment by capitalists then gives you is based on their rate of return. And if you presume, it's a simplifying assumption, which I'm happy to make when it actually is simplifying rather than fantasy, is there's some rough level of rate of profit that is the point at which capitalists are willing to invest everything they earn as investment, below which they'll pay off debt, above which they've got to borrow money to do more investment, then that target rate of return for capitalists sets the economic activity of the economy.
Mm.
You then have two other social classes. The remainder of the income goes to workers or bankers. Now, it doesn't matter to the capitalist who gets it. So as you get an increasing amount of debt accumulated, if there's a series of booms and busts, as we've seen leading up to the Minsky moment of 2008, as that debt level rises, because you've got to service that debt as a capitalist, more of the remainder of GDP, apart from your profit share, goes to servicing the banks and less goes to workers.
Yeah.
So that, to me, is the major factor that's caused the level of inequality since 1973, which was actually the first major debt credit crunch in capitalism.
And yet the argument which is given time and time again, perhaps by those people who've got their fingers in that financial pie, is that no, if you push up the incomes of workers, then it reduces the profitability of companies.
No, it reduces the profitability of banks, and that'd be a damn good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me, if the only thing I think we can really attack with, there's no chance in hell of changing hierarchy. We'll get back to your fantasy later if you like, because it is an intriguing fantasy. But the one thing we could do is reduce the level of private debt, and that would increase the workers' share, which would go a large way to closing all the gaps we're talking about.
The other argument you hear, of course, is, well, we've got to keep wages low because that, strangely, and there's a big leap of faith here, improves productivity because people have to work harder to be able to earn the money that they need to be able to afford the lifestyle they want, such as surviving.
And here's one of the interesting paradoxes in capitalism. Why was it that the spinning jenny was invented in Scotland rather than, for example, France?
Yeah, and we've talked about this. It was because,
and the reason is because wages in Scotland were higher. So there was a strong motivation for somebody to invent a way of getting more yarn out of one worker, which is where the first spinning jenny, which I think had 6 spindles rather than one, was invented. And then, of course, the mechanisation with coal, originally with water power, then with steam power, meant the industrialisation of Scotland. The spinning jenny,
low wages stop innovation, is in effect.
Exactly. High wages actually encourage it.
And that's possibly where we are now, which is why we're not seeing productivity increase and we're not seeing a great deal of innovation.
You've got to see these things in a dynamic sense. The neoclassical way of thinking, which we fall into so easily because it's become just part of the imprimatur of human thinking, the supply and demand curve with the time playing nowhere on the axes. It's the time pressure that pushes innovation, and that innovation is what drives the overall level of wealth. So high wages, paradoxically, can be, and I don't think wages when you get to the stage they instantly bankrupt the capitalists, but a higher level of wages and pressure on wages is a good reason for capitalists to invest that time working out a new form of technology to replace machinery with labor. And when you do that, because machines can handle more energy, there's no limit to the machinery. The limit is the energy you can supply in. Whereas for workers, give them more energy, it just doesn't matter. Let's get fatter. It doesn't increase the amount of spinning they can do to give your spinner 2 and 3 times as much food. So there is the encouragement to innovation actually comes out of high wages, not low. And
the other question is, on low wages, how much of that actually just gets transferred from the private sector to the public sector with benefits? So if you're a low paid worker, you get housing benefits, you get income support, you get child tax credits. In fact, in the UK, the government spends more than a quarter of all its spending on welfare. That includes pensions. So if you added pensions and payments made to low-income earners, it's 120 billion for pensions, 70 billion for benefits for working people on low income. Then that's basically, add those two together, and then basically a third of all that money goes to people of working age on low income. These are people working, but the state is subsidizing their existence in a way. So it's subsidizing those companies that are paying those low wages. So when we get something cheap from Amazon, well, we're also paying for it indirectly through taxes, aren't we?
Yeah, and that again is something which is likely to lead to less innovation over time. I mean, Amazon has obviously done very well out of that in its own innovation, but there's an advantage to having a society with pressure on wages all the time, which then means you've got pressure on innovation for capitalists, and you get this positive feedback, the predator-prey dynamics of capitalism, which incidentally, in which case, when you look at the mathematics of it, the workers are the predators and the capitalists are the prey. But that is what partly gives you the encouragement for technological advance over time, and that's what we need to get a high level of overall income, irrespective of the distribution of that income. And letting too much of it go to rentiers, which is where you've got money going to banks and money going to landlords. That is the unproductive stuff. Which actually, if you look at the history of economics, that's what Ricardo was mainly attacking with his argument for comparative advantage. It was really a sleight of hand about trade. His main argument was, and you can find this in Principles of Political Economy. He said that the capitalism effectively can continue growing so long as money goes to capitalists rather than landlords. So he was trying to find a way to reduce the corn prices, which would have no effect on workers because they've got to be paid the means of subsistence in his model. But the extra money that was now not going to landlords would go to capitalists, and there'd be more innovation, and you get a longer period of growth. And the same thing comes out of the physiocrats as well. So, and Adam Smith for that matter. So we've lost that whole idea of the emphasis in the early economists on the need to get more to capitalists and less to rentiers. Instead, we've let, in the name of capitalism, we've let rentiers take over the system. And in that case, they're parasites. They're not ones who innovate. They're not under that pressure to innovate. And all the stuff we're doing, as you mentioned beforehand, income supports for low-income workers, is removing that pressure for innovation, which is the one thing which gives capitalism a claim to be the best social system humans have invented after the early Cro-Magnon days, because it gives that innovation, and that's the defining feature of the human species.
Right, but I mean, the argument you often hear what you're leading to here then is saying, well, let's push up minimum wages. But if the argument's often given on minimum wages is, well, if you would you rather have a job at this rate or have no job at all? If you push the wages too high, then the argument is given that then the company becomes inefficient, so it doesn't employ people. But it could also equally be that the wages become so high the company is forced to innovate, and it doesn't need those people. It makes the money through mechanization.
Yeah, and then that's in that sense, that's
they've got no job at the end of it.
Well, absent the fact we're running into ecological limits of the planet, or probably run right past them, and it's currently consuming our way through our sustainability. What Baumol called cowboy capitalism period, when you were way, way, way below the restraints of the planet, that pressure for innovation is the thing which gives you the advantage in capitalism overall. So you don't want to just put up the prices and cause a collapse in the system. You want to put pressure on the income share going to workers while putting pressure on capitalists to innovate as well. And in that sense, the countries which have done best over the last 30 or 40 years, countries like Singapore. And I still vividly remember, I think it was in 1977 or 1978, Lee Kuan Yew unilaterally announced a 27% increase in wages across the board in Singapore. And if you couldn't pay it, tough shit, you had to shut down. Now, partly that was to drive Malay employees out of Singapore. I won't leave that little detail out. But the result was a dramatic increase in the already impressive innovation and industrialization of Singapore. So, so there are paradoxes in the way we think when you start thinking in a dynamic sense rather than an equilibrium one.
And I guess even not considering that innovation argument, you are going to see a shift in the distribution of income as well, aren't you? So if wages go up at restaurants, for example, restaurant bills are going to go up. But that's only going to afford those people who can afford to eat at restaurants. People who work in restaurants probably don't eat at restaurants. Their wages go up. Everyone else has to pay a bit more to eat out. And that's sort of like equalizing the income a little bit, isn't it?
Well, this is Henry Ford again. If you look back at Ford's, there's many negative things about Henry Ford, but one of the positives was he wanted his workers to be able to afford his own product, and that's then he paid the highest wages going, and at the same time to do it, he forced competition on his remaining rivals, and over time the price of the Model T Ford actually fell quite dramatically. I think it went from almost £800 to about $800 to about $200 over that period, because the mechanization tricks he was bringing in, the production line and so on, which he was the innovator of, all those things meant that his per unit cost dropped dramatically, even though he was paying workers much higher wages. So I think if we just get rid of the confusion that the marginal productivity theory throws in and think in terms of both hierarchy and innovation, we get a much better handle on how to reduce the impact of those gaps that are always going to be there for structural reasons, both age gaps and gender gaps, and still produce a more comfortable standard of living. Because if you go back to the 50s, people, even though they're worried, the whole issue of sexism and so on rose from that period on, people weren't worried about zero contract hours, low paid wages, meaning you've got to have 3 jobs, etc., etc.
No, it's the era when we'd never had it so good. We were
at that stage. We did, and we've lost that. And I think this is partly the debt bubble that has caused that complex system redistribution of income. But it's also the lack of innovation that's come forward, and the amount of the money that's been claimed by the rrontier side of human society rather than by the innovators.
If the answer is to push up minimum wage, and I guess we're talking relatively small differentials here, so maybe that partially explains what I'm about to ask you. But if you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of the spread of income, if you look at the minimum wage in Canada, it's in US dollars, according to the OECD, it's about $9.50. In Australia, it's over 12. The UK is halfway. Well, it's a little over $10. If you look at the Gini coefficient, Australia actually gets a worse score than Canada. So is it just minimum wage, or is it tax? Because another way of looking at it is the countries that have got a low Gini coefficient, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, they have a much higher tax. I'll give you some figures on that. If you look at the tax wedge, as they call it, which is the combined government income as a percentage of wages, for those who are earning the most, 70% over the average wage, in Australia and the US, they pay 34% in tax. In Denmark and Norway, where I've said the Gini coefficient is so much better, they pay 42% tax, 42% versus 34%. Now, that is a big difference, and the wage differential is far less in those countries.
Yeah, and at the same time, you have lower costs for public services. So transportation is much cheaper in the Netherlands, for example, than it is in the UK. So even though you're paying a higher amount to in taxes, the transportation and other costs that you face are significantly lower. And people seem a lot happier about the income distribution and their disposable income in the Netherlands in general than they are in the UK. So
what about the economic theory then? Getting back to that, this idea that, you are paid what you're worth. If you're underpaid, you're just going to look for another job.
Yeah, it's totally fallacious. There's no way that the people at the top of a hierarchy are paid what they're worth. They're paid the position in the hierarchy, and that's what Blair Phipps's research has done a brilliant job.
And they got there out of opportunity and prejudice and culture. I guess it's circumstance, isn't it?
Well, it's all sorts of. Again, this is a question: who rises to the top of a hierarchy? And yes, sometimes talent will be part of it, and obviously that's important. Sometimes also sheer sociopathy is part of it. And if we do a personality profile of people who get to the top of organisations versus those in the middle, you find a much higher incidence of narcissistic personality disorder and other wonderful personal traits that you don't want to have in control. So it's a question of how do you avoid that happening when a hierarchy actually encourages it in the first place.
Yeah. And then, of course, we've got all these abuses as well, which, it seems clear, doesn't it? Apart from increasing minimum wage, you've also got to stop perpetuating the problem. So we have zero-hour contracts. In 2011, there were 200,000 people on zero-hour contracts in the UK. 5 years later, it was 750,000. So we've had this big emergence of the gig economy, paying unsustainable wages to keep prices down under the argument from these companies that they are market disruptors. What I don't get is, how does that happen? Why do investors support businesses with a model that is so flawed? Surely you can see through all of that and go, well, this isn't going to last 10 years because you can't keep on paying people at such a low wage.
Yeah, I know. And again, this is where a sense of some sort of sense of social responsibility is an important element of a functional society. When you get to the stage where the vast majority of people, which are the workers make up, of course, the vast majority, face absolute insecurity, and in fact, the risks of capitalism have been passed on to the workers. Because if you required a minimum of 4 hours, which used to be the situation, you couldn't have a part-time worker called in for work unless they were guaranteed to get 4 hours pay, which made it worth the while to get there. And you're talking, say, a restaurant, and they said, oh, okay, you get there and there's not enough customers, you can go back home again. The risk of capitalism is passed from the capitalist to the worker. Now that's just not that isn't on the pardon me, that isn't on the marketing leaflet for capitalism. Capitalism is supposed to be a place where the capitalists take the risk and they're supposed to be rewarded for taking the risk. If they can pass the risk onto the worker instead, you have a society which is heading towards pitchforks.
But that's the big shift, actually, isn't it? When you think about it, in almost every walk of life, you can think the risk is being passed back to the user pays type. Up. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. User pays type approach in a way.
Yeah, and that we're seeing. Look at the revolts we're seeing around the planet right now. I mean, the extent to which there is violence from the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy is quite remarkable. And this is what's been missed out, the weakening of trade union power, the fact that trade unions no longer have any real existence anywhere, the people have to bargain on their own against a hierarchy which is far larger than them, et cetera, You're getting 0-hour contracts, all this nonsense about people having, what do they call those jobs when kids don't get paid? They call them...
jobs in McDonald's? Oh, no, they don't get paid. No, they do get paid in McDonald's, where they don't get paid.
No, I'm thinking about
like a work experience type thing.
Work experience type thing. I forgot what they give them a particular formal name for them. All this stuff, the risk has been passed on to the person at the bottom of the hierarchy, and that's showing we need countervailing force against those hierarchies, and that again is left out of the neoclassical way of thinking. There's no need for countervailing force when you have the price mechanism. I'm sorry, there is, and abolishing trade unions, getting 0-hour contracts, the stuff where kids have to work for free to be. It is just a appalling situation.
I remember in the 70s, the 80s. This would have been. I was looking for jobs. I was living in the north of England, and if someone wanted to interview you, they would pay your train ticket down to London and pay you an allowance for lunch to go for the interview. It's a big shift to the way companies operate these days, isn't it?
Yeah, and that it is said that it's the excessive power now of the hierarchy against the disorganized. So back to your fantasy again. Could we ever get to the stage where we're all in disorganized small groups? That to me, in some ways, is an ultimate ambition of a human species that is going to have a sustainable culture over the long term if we get through the ecological crisis, because as a species, we're most comfortable in a group of 150 or less. That's what's called the Dunbar number. The number of interhuman relationships we can actually handle maxes out at about 150. That's a lot more than it does for chimpanzees, which is about 20 or 30, and for other members of the simian species. But that's how we survive. We can relate to 150 people. Without hierarchy, there could be no organization bigger than about 150 or 200. So hierarchy lets you combine many, many more people together and bring about the complex societies in which we're part of. But they become actually antithetical to that human feeling of you want to bond with 150 people. If anybody hasn't read this, I highly recommend reading Nelson Mandela's autobiography, A Long Road to... Is it Long Walk to Freedom?
Yeah.
I think that's the title. And in that, he explained what it felt like to be a member of the Xhosa tribe. And he said he thought there's nothing better in the world than being a member of that tribe. And the thing was because in those small tribal communities, the level of bonding, the level of friendship, the intensity of relationships, when the societies are sustainable and not under breakdown pressure, that's an incredibly affirming thing for the human species. And we've lost that in this modern hierarchical society in which we live.
Right. So you're saying that we could live without hierarchy?
I think we should make it an ambition, but we can only do it to get to the stage where all production is taking place in von Neumann machines off planet.
Good Lord! We seem to have run out of time
You're
to
talking
extend
fantasy.
on that.
I'm sci-fi, a long way ahead of you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time. We can't really embellish that point any further. But yeah, I guess just one final point then on that before we get to that the hierarchy. We've talked about the need to reduce the gap, and obviously wage bargaining is a big part of that. I mean, the removal of the union movement has probably been perhaps out of more than anything was spoken about today is perhaps the biggest influence on all of this.
And neoclassical economics played a vital role in destroying the union movement because I know from having been raised in this particular religion that the economists believe there should be no trade unions because they put the price of labour above the marginal product. Destroying the union movement was a major part of leading to the level of unemployment and inequality and social breakdown that we have today.
We'll leave it on that point. Thank you, Steve. Catch you again next
Go on.
week.
Okay.
Next week, we are going to look at what are called externalities in economics. These are factors that cost you or benefit you, for which you've made no contribution or for which you bear no blame. Can we cost more of these externalities? And should we? For example, if there's a new railway station that pushes up your house price because it's close by, should you see all the benefits of that? Or if a new airport pushes prices down because of aircraft noise, should you get compensation? And what about public services? If you use them more than most, does that mean you should pay more? We'll look at that question of whether we can price in externalities, whether technology enables us to do more with that sort of thing. We'll look at that next week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.